in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, and ESPN. Professor Beydoun served on the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights for 3 years and earned a coveted Open Society Foundation's Equality Fellowship. He has been named one of the 500 most influential Muslims of the world and is currently working on his third book, examining Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. Professor Beydoun is a native of Detroit, Michigan, and holds degrees from the University of Michigan, the University of Toronto, UCLA, and Harvard. And the other person who will be involved in this is Professor Nazita Lajevardi. Professor Lajevardi, I've introduced her before, but I'll introduce her again. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2017, her JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law in 2012, and her BA from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Her work focuses mainly on issues related to race and ethnic politics, political behavior, voting rights, and immigration, and she's the author of the acclaimed book, Outsiders at Home, The Politics of American Islamophobia. And I will turn it over to Professor Lajevardi, who will be moderating this session.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for the very warm welcome. And welcome, Professor Beydoun. It is such a distinct honor to be able to have this conversation with you. And so thank you so much for being a part of this conference. I wish it was in person, but alas, inshallah, one day we'll all be in person together. I want to sort of set out the process for today's conversation. So we have a lot of time, and I've prepared some questions for Professor Beydoun, and we'll have a discussion about these issues. And then we'd love to open it up to Q&A. I mean, we have such a remarkable scholar, advocate, and pioneer with us today, so I'm sure so many people have questions for you as well. So I'm not going to hog all the time, but I want to put that out there. I just want to begin by saying that I admire your outreach and your advocacy a tremendous amount. And you have really paved the path for those of us in the United States who are working on Islamophobia, both as academics, but also in the policy space. And a lot of what you do is through social media. And I think as we move on in this conversation, it'll be really important for all of us to keep in mind that a lot of the impact, the tacit impact that Professor Beydoun has in this world is in his ability to reach people and to communicate his work. And I think especially for those of us who are here all talking about the media, there is a way in which Muslims, we can use the media, and especially those of us who are studying Muslims and misrepresentation in the media, there's ways in which we can also leverage the media. And there's this ability that we have that I think we can really learn from you. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you got started building a social media profile, and then we can kind of begin to go back through the questions I sent you earlier.
Yeah, first off, thank you so much. I'm really honored and humbled to be invited to the Muslim Studies Conference. I've attended before in the past. I followed the department's work for a long time, so this is definitely a distinct honor and a privilege for me. So I think for me, the way I sort of navigated a career in academia was I'm sort of a coincidental academic. I never really aspired to become a professor or a law professor. Early on in my undergraduate studies, I was always an activist. I was always an advocate. I was mobilized at a young age around international issues, things that were happening in Palestine or Iraq and my native countries, Lebanon and Egypt, but also what was happening domestically here stateside with regard to not only racial injustice and surveillance of Muslim communities, but racial inequity at large. Before 9/11, I was really mobilized around those issues at a really young age. So for me, my lure to academia was it provided a platform to do two things. First, I think teach the next generation of thinkers, journalists in the law, individuals who become judges and politicians. That really allured to me. And then second, the individuals that I, emulated at a young age, people like Edward Said and, Kimberly Crenshaw and Cornel West. These were individuals who were public intellectuals, but they were they were formerly academics. So for me, academia seemed a platform where I could teach individuals within an academic institution, but also use that post as sort of a place to sort of shape public opinion really broadly. And obviously, the advent and the emergence of social media just expanded and pronounced an academic's ability to reach people really broadly. So to be honest with you, it was never sort of strategized. It was it wasn't something that I sort of like laid out and mapped out. It just kind of happened, and I think it stems from just sort of my inclination as an activist.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you just touched upon, if I could, continue in that line of thinking about your activism about, civil liberties and, racial injustice, broadly speaking, that, that forum into this policy space is, I assume, created an avenue to be able to also communicate issues with respect to Muslims, right? So experience in trying to advocate for racial injustice that stems beyond Muslim Americans has probably created a really important platform in trying to insert Muslims into the dialogue as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, much of it stems from my own experience. Like, the term intersectionality obviously is very pervasive, and it's kitsch and it's sexy. But, I grew up at a time where, my experience as a Muslim American was very much unique. I grew up in a poor working class community to a single mother who was an immigrant from Egypt, in a largely Black community. So many of the issues that I was sort of mobilized at an early age were issues like affirmative action, over policing of Black communities. I went to a high school for many years where turnover of teachers was a real issue. So issues around inequality with regard to education. Those issues were just as important to me as issues that pertain specifically to Muslim Americans. So for me, even though now it's obviously really popular, it's become sort of the norm, but 25 years ago, for me to draw connections between the experience of Muslim Americans and African Americans and Latino Americans and Indigenous Americans at large, it was very natural. Those were natural connections that I made. So I never viewed Muslim American civil liberties issues as being distinct or isolated from these broad concerns that other marginalized communities experience. And that's what drove me to want to attend UCLA and study critical race studies under people like Kimberly Crenshaw before 9/11. But it's heartening to see that this has become mainstream today.
As a fellow Bruin, I appreciate that. So this is a great segue to your book, your first book. If you guys don't know, Professor Beydoun has written like the landmark first sort of overview of American Islamophobia in the United States. And I love walking into Barnes and Nobles. I'm from Orange County, California. I walked into Barnes and Nobles and there it was, in Barnes and Nobles. And I said to my friend Arzu, I said, oh my God, like, it's amazing that you can walk in and you can see this book, right now. How much has happened and, where have we really arrived that this is our reality today? And so this book does such a great job in not only kind of tracing some of the history of American Islamophobia, but also kind of coming up with distinctions about the types of discrimination that folks are experiencing in the United States. And so, in this book, you argue that Islamophobia is nothing new. And it began when, the first enslaved people were forcibly brought to the United States. And I wonder if you could do a little bit for us in tracing the history of Islamophobia as you do in your book, sort of to, not all of us are from the United States. I'm sure you heard like this is a pretty global conference. And so not everyone is familiar with that history. And I think it would be really helpful to hear a bit.
Yeah, so I think the American experience or project with regard to Islamophobia is definitely distinct from what's taking place in France or England or, obviously India and China now. There's a distinct legal history And I study Islamophobia primarily from a legal prism. So that's the principal sort of metric that I use to assess Islamophobia's roots, origins, and obviously its modern day expansion. So even though the term Islamophobia is a new and novel term, right? It's a term that sort of emerged into the popular and scholarly discourses, I would say, in a very robust way in the last decade. The phenomenon itself is anything but new, especially with regard to the American experience. And Professor and Professor Muhammad also know, and I'm sure everybody on this call is really familiar with the backdrop and the undergirding foundation of Orientalism, right? This discourse that oriented Islam is sort of the antithesis of everything Western and everything civilized and everything good and proper, right? In the United States, whiteness legally stood as very much the architecture of not only citizenship but humanity. So I trace the origins of Islamophobia from a legal perspective to this law that was enacted at the earliest stages of America becoming a sovereign nation. This naturalization law of 1790, which was in place until 1952, which mandated that individuals had to be white to become naturalized citizens. This was the law of the land for 75% of this country's existence. It stood 2 years after the United States became a sovereign nation. And in the sort of codified construction of whiteness to be synonymous with citizenship and humanity, Islam was positioned as being inassimilable, right, with being oppositional to whiteness. So individuals who identified as Muslim, who tried to come to the United States as Muslim, whether they were individuals who came as immigrants or whether they were individuals who came as chattel property, as enslaved Africans toiling in southern plantations, their religious identity or their conspicuous or performed religious identity eliminated them as white. So we see really early on how Islam was racialized as a distinct race and sort of conceived of to be far more than just a religion, right? It was definitely in the minds of American courts, and I write about this in the book, but I write about it in an article called Between Muslim and White, how American law sort of legally entrenched the idea that Muslim identity is a racial identity, and it's a racial identity that cannot be squared and reconciled with whiteness. So these are the roots and origins of American Islamophobia, the very roots, and obviously in the coming years and decades, additional laws, policies, but also beyond what I call structural Islamophobia, popular discourses cemented the idea that Islam was a rival, not only a rival religion, not only a rival civilization in Edward Said's terms, but also a rival race. And you know this, you write about this in your book as well, very trenchantly. But these are the very, building blocks of what we call American Islamophobia today.
Yeah, and I think it's so. Thank you so much for offering that distinction in that history. I think the legal classification of whiteness and how that has set Muslims in America, particularly those from the Middle East, on different trajectories compared to especially Black Muslims, is really important and highlights that racial diversity within the Muslim population in the United States is something that we need to think very deeply about. And so I want to kind of I want to go in two different avenues. The first is I want to talk a little bit about how American Muslims differ from the Muslim populations in other Western democracies. And you kind of talk about this in your upcoming book a little bit. But I think it would be helpful for the audience, since we're such a global audience, to have a discussion about that American Muslims in the United States are a very different group than the Muslims that you see in France and the Muslims that you see in the UK. And part of that is like through immigration law, right? Part of that is through colonialism, these practices that go back historically that have created some selection effect that the Muslim populations that you see in these different contexts actually do differ quite a bit from one another. So I was wondering if you could comment on that or if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, really, really broadly. I mean, obviously, Muslim communities across the world are distinct in a myriad of ways, depending on, like you highlight, the colonial experience of the host nation, and second, Islamophobia, in my view, as shaped in these distinct countries, is, very much curated by the host country's law. So when you look at the Muslim American population in the United States, for instance, much of it is shaped by immigration law, like you said. For instance, in 1965, we had quotas that were in place that were finally lifted, which enabled large swaths of Muslim diasporas or in populations to come from all over the world that were restricted before 1965. And then obviously, like you mentioned, the United States has this backdrop of a large segment, not only a large segment, but a large sort of, initial early chapter of the Muslim American experience being reflected in the African American experience, right? Roughly 20 to 25% of enslaved Africans in antebellum America were Muslims when they came and tried to continue practicing Islam when they were toiling on plantations. Not every England, for instance, didn't have domestic slavery, so it doesn't have that early chapter of enslaved Muslims on the ground in that country. I think the second major factor, like you said, is the colonial sort of exploits of the imperial nation. So the Muslim populations, in England, where I am right now, largely tend to be former British colonies, right? So the Indian subcontinent, English-speaking African nations are highly represented in the Muslim populations here stateside. And obviously there's a geographic proximity with Europe that isn't the case with the United States, that, sort of shapes a distinct sort of Islamophobia in countries like England. Places like France, obviously, you have really, a virulent type of Islamophobia that's shaped by, sort of the hostility of French colonialism as a historical backdrop. We see that manifested, I think, most vividly through the war in Algeria, the turbulent history with Algeria. But also second in terms of the governing laws of the land. I think, so just to, obviously the question is very broad, but I think the best way I can sort of like narrowly respond to it is to say that in the United States, for instance, Islamophobia is distinctly shaped by the fact that we have a First Amendment that at least theoretically enables free exercise of religion, right? Which in some ways tempers or diminishes the prospect of enacting laws that we see in France. France does not have a free exercise of religion clause. It has this broad principle of laïcité, which essentially enshrines secularism. And as a consequence of that enshrinement of secularism, the state uses secularism as sort of a bludgeon to suppress free exercise of religion. So in addition to demographics being distinct, we see Islamophobia being distinctly deployed and enforced by the state as a reflection of the distinct kind of laws that are in place in these distinct host countries. Yeah. So I hope I didn't.
That was wonderful. Thank you. No, I think that did a great job. I kind of want to, before we get to the Islamophobia of current day, I think it's important to talk about American Islamophobia prior to 9/11. Yeah. Because it's not as though it was non-existent. Islamophobia did in fact exist. And in fact, a lot of it was targeted towards Black Muslims. And I think the law enforcement surveillance of, like, for instance, the Nation of Islam is something, when we talk about surveillance practices in a post 9/11 era and how that's one of the manifestations of an overreaching reaction to 9/11 and in turn manifestation of Islamophobia, it's not as though this is anything new. This had happened to subsets of the Muslim population prior to that. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the type of Islamophobia that predates 9/11 as, so just so we can paint some context for folks.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because you can definitely trace, so modern surveillance and the way surveillance is deployed, and obviously surveillance is changing now with big tech and sort of corporate and surveillance capitalism sort of spearheading how surveillance is being deployed today. But the post 9/11 style surveillance was definitely architected on the back of surveilling the Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, civil rights and racial justice organizations that really emerged in the 1960s. Now, and there's been a lot of debate amongst, scholars and even advocates about whether it was Islamophobia that sort of fueled the surveillance of the Nation of Islam. Was it more anti-Muslim animus, or was it more anti-Black suspicion and animus? To me, it seems that it might be a mix of both, right? Because on one hand, the FBI, for long periods of time, and there's language from J. Edgar Hoover, who led the FBI at the time and really had it in for the Nation of Islam, didn't really think about the Nation of Islam as being bona fide Muslims, right? He rejected and dismissed the fact that these individuals were legitimate and bona fide Muslims. So that viewpoint might lend to the fact that this might not have been full-fledged Islamophobia as we understand it today, and it was more driven by anti-Black racism and the notion that movements for Black independence and sovereignty and dignity were very much driven primarily by anti-Black racism. But whether it was Islamophobia in its full-blown form or not doesn't really matter, right? Because that surveillance in the 60s still sort of laid the groundwork for the kind of strategies the state used pre 9/11, like you said, not only to Black communities, but even Arab and Muslim and non-Black Muslim communities. We had this law enacted in 1996 called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which really establishes and then broadly enforces surveillance of Arab and Muslim communities pre 9/11. But like you said, programs like COINTELPRO, the strategy to break up the Nation of Islam, these were more than surveillance programs. The strategy behind these surveillance programs like COINTELPRO was in the short-term surveillance, but the real long-term objective was to destroy these organizations. And that, in my opinion, and I've written about counter-radicalization post 9/11, that is the honest objective of the state, to destroy specific elements and institutions within the Muslim community that the state perceives to be subversive or threatening.
Yeah. And we'll get into this in a bit because one of the strategies that the state does use is infiltration into the community and trying to create informants. And so I want to talk about the utility of American Muslims to the state as only being, as Hillary Clinton stated, the eyes and ears of the country. And so, I want to get into that in a bit. But I guess this is also a really good segue into talking about 9/11. Obviously, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, they shifted the sociopolitical positioning of American Muslims. As we know in the Patriot Act, I think it's section 102 is a section where they actually say, this is not about Arabs, Muslims, South Asians, et cetera. Like it actually, the state is conflating all of these different groups in the very text of the Patriot Act. And so the Patriot Act and ensuing laws also, they did a lot to centralize American Muslims in the eyes of the public, and also with powers that they gave to law enforcement as well. And so I think it's important to talk a little bit about how did these laws, these pieces of legislation, affect the sociopolitical positionality of American Muslims in your view?
Yeah, put simply, these laws that came into being post 9/11, the Patriot Act, NSEERS, the National Security Exit and Entry Registration System, the Total Information Act years later, but also I think beyond just the enactment and passage of these laws, right? You had the sort of restructuring of the state to fixate specifically on this elevated Muslim threat, right? So the Department of Homeland Security came into being, right? The state entirely redid and reformed how it went about, tending to its national security policy, but it's also its immigration policy. So immigration was fully integrated into national security through the establishment of this new institution, which to me is a more sort of lucid manifestation of fixating on Muslims as being the primary threat. You can enact laws and bring about legislation every day. There's nothing sort of, exciting about that, but to change the entire government demonstrates a market shift to signify to the public at large and to the world at large, because this was a global war on terror, yet that these Muslims are not only sort of a principal domestic national security threat, but they're now geopolitical enemy number one of being a global security threat. So we see the elevation of Arabs, Muslims, anybody who kind of fit within this, grand Arab caricature as not only being a domestic sort of national security or criminal threat, this demographic or broad caricature was elevated to being the principal geopolitical civilizational threat post 9/11, which makes it very dangerous, obviously, for Muslim Americans here stateside, but makes it dangerous for Muslims everywhere across the globe. All 1.6 however many 2 billion Muslims at the time, because domestic laws and restructuring of American government justify and foreshadow the wars that take place post 9/11. They foreshadow and justify the kind of alliances and relationships the United States makes with foreign governments to carry on collateral and proxy wars against Muslim populations in other countries. So I think it's an understatement to say that Muslims become the new principal security threat. I think they elevate to being the primary geopolitical civilizational threat.
Yeah, I hate to elevate the voice of Samuel Huntington, but he did
Yeah.
call it a clash of civilizations. And I think what happened in the wake of 9/11 very clearly showed that, our representatives certainly believe that to be the case as well. So, I think it's important to have a discussion about the types of ways in which the American Muslim population was targeted. Certainly, Muslim immigrants were targeted. Potential immigrants were also targeted, as you mentioned. But at home, right, events, practices, procedures were in place to target and that otherized this domestic population. There was an infiltration at MSAs across the nation. There was the NYPD conducting surveillance practices on students at Yale. So, I mean, there's like jurisdictional issues. There was an attempt to recruit informants. Section 215 of the Patriot Act had like warrantless gag orders from tech companies to turn over phone records. You can talk to American Muslims and they oftentimes will tell you that their phones were being tapped and they kind of knew when that clicking sound was going on. So a lot was happening. And I think what made the American Muslim population distinct, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe what made it distinct from in terms of their experiences with law enforcement is that they had federal law enforcement, on their backs. It wasn't just the type of state and local law enforcement that you might have on your back just existing in this world as a Black or brown person. You also had the additional attention of federal law enforcement. So there was quite a bit happening to the domestic population. And I think it would be worthy of talking about the different types of practices that ensued over this period of time.
Yeah, you definitely had not only federal law enforcement and also local law enforcement, but collaboration between federal and local law enforcement. We see that most vividly through programs like countering violent extremism and counter-radicalization, right? So there was really novel, in many ways unprecedented relationships being forged between the FBI, the CIA, with local police departments, whether it be the Detroit Police Department, the LAPD, the Boston PD, where they were working symbiotically to, like you mentioned, like seed informants within MSAs, within mosques, within Muslim businesses, within civic organizations, and in some respects, even within households, right? So it was novel in the sense that you had sort of a multi-pronged state-sponsored Islamophobia going after Muslims in a very menacing and ominous way that hadn't been the case. It hasn't been the case with other marginalized communities. There are parallels with other marginalized communities, but it wasn't as fierce as it was with Muslim Americans post 9/11. So one analogy would be with Latinx Americans. You have ICE, for instance, which is a federal agency working in conjunction with local police departments to identify undocumented individuals. Right, but in many respects, that was passive for a long time until the Obama administration, where it became more proactive. With regard to the Muslim American experience, with FISA, which you cite, the provision in the Patriot Act, CVE, NSEERS. I remember at UCLA when I was a law student, a number of my Iranian friends were being rounded up, international students, some of them being forced to leave, and some of them being forced to surrender themselves to these forced interviews. These were individuals who came to the United States to study political science or history, or the individuals who were studying chemistry and things that were stereotypically linked to terrorism were in real trouble. But yeah, it was a really frightening time post 9/11. And now that we're 2 decades away, it's easy for us to forget how intense it was. But the fact that you had the federal government cracking down on really vulnerable and innocent communities in a serious way, highlights what can come to pass, in any day now.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I appreciate, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, and for sharing that experience at UCLA, I've certainly had a number of people who I know who've been through similar experiences. Um, I think one thing that, the public often wonders is, did 9/11 happen and Islamophobia come about the next day? Was Islamophobia, like, this backlash rather, was it instantaneous, or did it take time to marinate? Did it take time to form? How did this come to be? Were these processes occurring overnight, or did, in your opinion, did this take time to become more institutionalized and to become more cemented?
There's two great pieces that I'd recommend everybody read. One is called A Rage Shared by law professor Munir Ahmed. He teaches at Yale Law School, I believe. And then a second piece called The Citizen and the Terrorist by Letty Volk. And just to sort of like summarize, those articles really sort of, go to the heart of what the question you're asking, Nazita. The first point is this: Professor Volpe says that these Orientalist and bigoted tropes about Muslims were so deeply entrenched as a consequence of, broad Orientalism, whether it be legal Orientalism or popular Orientalism, the kind of films we watch, the news headlines about Muslim Americans, the popular stereotypes that were so deeply entrenched before 9/11. When 9/11 happened, they instantly rose to the fore, right? And to cite Professor Ahmed, when they rose to the fore, the American polity was so sort of impassioned by these stereotypes, and they were so familiar with these negative stereotypes and tropes about Muslim Americans that it was quick for them to mobilize to seek vengeance on behalf of the state for the 9/11 terror attacks. That's why we see this prolific rise in hate crimes and hate incidents immediately after 9/11. And you write about this and talk about this as well. They weren't only attacking Muslims, right? They were attacking anybody who looked like a Muslim. So individuals who were Sikh, individuals who were Hindu, on the West Coast, individuals who were Mexican were also being attacked because they fit within the Muslim profile. So the deep-seated entrenchment of Orientalism pre 9/11 seeded this really robust image of the negative Muslim and the terrorist that enabled people to sort of unleash in very violent ways post 9/11 and attack anybody who looked like a Muslim. The dangerous thing is this: is I remember being a young activist and a young student at the time, is Islamophobia, the word wasn't existing yet. And then second, Islamophobia wasn't a principal racial or social justice issue. So individuals or communities who are our allies today, whether it be other communities of color, other communities on the left, didn't really care about Muslim civil liberties issues post 9/11. So we were kind of at it by ourselves and for ourselves at that juncture, which made it really hard because in conjunction with us fending off this discrimination from society and the state at large, we had a lot of sort of educational organizing work to do within the community to tell our potentially allied communities that our concerns should be ones that you should champion and endorse as well. So it was a really hard time from many vantage points.
No, I think that raises a really good segue to my next question, which is about, who are the allies that, the Muslim community has been able to turn to. And I've often been very critical in my own work, looking at representation by political officials of the Democratic Party and their responsiveness and representation of Muslim communities. And, I think it's worthwhile to have a discussion about what happened prior to the 2016 campaign, because there's a lot that we can talk about for the 2016 campaign, we will. But I think it's important to talk about the CVE practices that ensued under the Obama administration. And I think it's important to talk about, where the degree to which, even Democratic president was not, was sort of under his administration, there were CVE practices that were widespread and that did continue to target the Muslim community. And so even, in this era of hope, right, there was still an intensive targeting of the Muslim American population.
Yeah, I think the Obama administration sort of ushered in and foreshadowed many of the political dilemmas that the Muslim American population broadly faces today. I mean, on firsthand, it sort of ushers in this moment of racial capitalism that's deployed by the state, where Obama, who is a very clever statesman, both domestically and globally, embraces sort of surface diversity and multiculturalism as sort of a selling point to the public at large, but is very much still wed to the war on terror, but distinctly deployed. So he merges the two. He merges this sort of superficial commitment to diversity with this still steadfast commitment to the war on terror by saying, if I say the right things about Muslims, we have to integrate, we have to, mend the wounds of the war on terror. Muslims are part of the United States, all of which, from a rhetorical standpoint is right. It's true. And you can see why it's seductive. Obama recognizes that he can lure and then bring in segments of the Muslim American population to be the faces and the mouthpieces for his new surveillance program, which is counter-radicalization. And for counter-radicalization to function, you need visible Muslim stakeholders as leaders. And then second, you need Muslim informants and infiltrators to be the individuals on the ground to make it work. And Obama's rhetoric of, lauding Islam and talking about inclusion and multiculturalism becomes the rhetorical expedient or instrument that enables the functioning of CVE to work, because that language makes it palatable for many Muslims, many Muslims on the left, but also the center, to want to become part of that administration. And I write about this in an article called, Acting Muslim, where being a Muslim comes with incentives, political incentives, professional incentives, that the Obama administration capitalizes on to push forward CVE. And we see that today, I think, in a more pronounced sort of fashion as a consequence of this new, I don't know how to say it, but this new moment of sort of superficial fixation on multiculturalism and diversity, where the Biden administration is definitely doing the same thing as the Obama administration, but on a bigger scale.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I think it compromises the positionality of Muslim Americans, where you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, where, on the surface, there are words of inclusion and belonging, but in practice, exclusion and otherization continues. And so there's this, I think, feeling in the community of being gaslit almost.
Yeah.
I think
What's
now
I never knew what that meant. What's gaslit mean?
Gaslit is kind of like when you feel a certain way, but people make you feel like you're crazy for feeling that way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, my millennial status just became very apparent. I want to talk a little bit. I think this is a good point to talk a bit about. I was going to ask this towards the end of our conversation, but I want to talk about Asian American hate. As I think our audience members, if not everyone already knows, hate crimes have risen quite a bit against the Asian American community in the wake of COVID-19. And the rates are astronomical. And I don't know, for those of you who've seen these signs, they're all over Southern California, that there's billboards that write Asian American, but highlight the words, "I am American." And so it seems like the response from the Asian American community has been, I don't need to prove my model minority status to you. I belong. We belong. The end. And I've really admired actually this response from the Asian American community, because I think in the Muslim community particularly, what has been asked of us by elected officials and by elites has been, prove that you are not dangerous, prove that you are patriotic, prove that you have utility to us in the state. And so I'm wondering, if you see any symmetries there, or if you agree, disagree, if you can speak to a little bit about, the utility of Muslim Americans to American society.
I think there's been an evolution, to be frank with you, with regard to how Muslim Americans are responding to sort of, these ultimatums of patriotism and belonging. I think post 9/11, you're exactly right. You saw a lot of performing Americanness by way of Muslims, hanging signs, changing their names, people choosing not to express their religiosity or hiding their ethnicities in ways that made them, appear more more quote unquote American or white American, right? I think, for me, I think, it was eye-opening to leave Detroit because Detroit has, so many Arab and so many Muslims. When I went to California, I saw this performance of non-Muslim identity, Americanness to be far more pronounced than it was in Michigan, because obviously there's safety and safe haven in numbers, right? But I'll say this, I'll say that there's real difference when you juxtapose the Trump era with the immediate aftermath of the post 9/11 era, because younger Muslims were far more unapologetic about being Muslim and sort of rejected this sort of ultimatum that they had to suppress or surrender their Muslimness during the Trump era that their parents or previous generations did post 9/11. I'm not making a normative assessment to say that they're braver. I think it was, in many respects, it was easier in that the previous generations enabled them to take this more unapologetic and courageous stance. The reality is this, like I mentioned earlier, is, post 9/11, Muslim Americans were neither embraced by the left or the right. Our civil liberties concerns were very much fringe and marginalized, weren't championed by the social justice mainstream. So we were left on an island where we were sort of like forgotten by the left, and while being sort of attacked by the right and by the state. What we saw during the Trump era, where Muslims were more unapologetic about their identity, was the left had fully embraced Muslims as being, part of this broader sort of community of marginalized groups. And as a consequence of having, an alliance with Asian Americans, like you mentioned, the black communities, even the LGBTQ communities, right, embrace Muslims for the first time as a consequence of Trump and the Muslim ban. That kind of safety and these kinds of alliances enables communities to be more unapologetic and proud of who they are. And that's what the difference is. With regard to Asian American hate, I think you see a similar consequence, that if this new generation that is, very proud and very assertive of who they are, their parents' generation wasn't the same. You see similar performances of, Americanness in covering Asian identity during the internment era, for instance, where a lot of Japanese Americans were looking to perform, and the Korematsu case is, one that where Japanese Americans were saying, we're Americans first, we speak English, we don't speak Japanese. So these performances are not novel and not exclusive to the Muslim American community.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate that nuance. And I think the two distinctions that you made about, timing and also cohort generational status, I think is very important. So I think that's very well put. The opportunities for coalition building that exists today in the wake of the Trump era across a number of progressive, especially groups, or BIPOC groups, is just been really, really profound. So let's talk about the Trump era. Let's talk about the 2016 campaign. That campaign arguably situated American Muslims and foreign Muslims, global Muslims, at the forefront of our national discourse. There were a number of different practices and rhetoric that was espoused throughout the presidential campaign. And being a political scientist, it's like, I have to go back to the politicians, and I wonder from your standpoint and from the lens that you have both as a scholar as well as, an advocate, in what way did you see that rhetoric affect the American Muslim population themselves?
I think it had a twofold effect. It sort of had an intra-Muslim community effect and an inter-Muslim community effect. The intra effect is that it made explicit what we've known for a long time with regard to the state's otherization and demonization of Muslim Americans. It was more express and explicit. I think it was a wake-up call for Americans at large to really finally appreciate the fact that anti-Muslim animus and Islamophobia is a real thing. I think war on terror policy, because it's very technical, most Americans don't know what the Patriot Act is. Most Americans struggle with whether the war in Afghanistan or Iraq was a legitimate war or not. They're consuming news. They're not reading scholarship. But for Americans at large, I'm talking about non-Muslims here, to hear that a viable presidential candidate wanted to ban Muslims to come to the United States, that really woke them up to be like, yo, this Islamophobia thing is a real thing. We got to be serious about it, right? This is a form of bigotry and a form of racism that for many African Americans, they can draw parallels with anti-Black racism. It was explicit, it was in your face, right? Trump was somebody who was unabashed about his bigotry for Latinx Americans, for even working class whites who, and whites at large who had liberal sensibilities and views. For a presidential candidate who became president to say these kinds of things about Muslims, Islam hates us and whatever rhetoric he espoused, was a real wake-up moment for the country at large, to really wrap their heads around Islamophobia being a really ominous form of bigotry that we got to take seriously. So in retrospect, in the grand arc of things, it might have been a good thing because it sort of like positions Islamophobia as a cornerstone racial justice issue that not only Muslims have to rally around, but anybody who opposes racism has to rally around.
I think you've probably read that hate crimes rose against American Muslims around the time of the election. And so fear was particularly high in the American Muslim community. My own research shows that American Muslims actually stopped posting on social media as much in the wake of campaign events. And so there were reactions and there were actual tacit effects. I think what we've seen, throughout the COVID-19 era with people, rallying around armed militia in our state capitol, as well as, around our national capital, in January, that sort of prospect of armed militia and perhaps hate against hate being espoused by white nationalists was something that I think Muslims began to feel very distinctly in their own lives in the wake of this initial campaign moment and in the aftermath of the election. And so I don't know how much you've followed the hate crime situation, but I'm wondering, if you want to remark a bit about the types of ways in which the lives of American Muslims were threatened in the aftermath of the election.
Yeah, I've read that hate crimes, circa the election, rivaled the degree of hate crimes and hate incidents, in the immediate aftermath of post 9/11. You saw spikes that were really concerning, and much of it I think is a direct correlation to the rhetoric coming out of the mouth of not only Donald Trump, but remember the other presidential candidates, Carson, Cruz. They were less sort of frequent with their Islamophobic comments, but it was very much part of the Republican presidential discourse, and in some respects, the Democratic presidential discourse in more guised ways. But what that rhetoric does, especially from somebody is sort of colorful and people might disagree, but as charismatic as Trump, is this language functions as a dictate, right? It functions as a communique to society at large. It authorizes the kind of violence to say that, hey, if I believe that Muslims are, Syrian refugees are, using their persecution as a Trojan horse to bring in terrorists in the country, and Islam hates us, this kind of language functions as fuel for hate mongers on the ground to say, hey, it's okay for you to go attack these Muslims because they're not citizens, they're not residents, these are our enemies and they're a threat. And I think second, when you talk about white supremacy, what Islamophobia does as a broader project post 9/11, and especially in terms of how it's curated by a candidate and then President Trump, is it sort of reshapes the agenda of white supremacist outfits, right? White supremacists pre 9/11 didn't really care about Muslims. They cared about Black folks, they cared about Jews, they cared about, quote unquote, Latinx immigrants in the South. They didn't really care much about Muslims. What the war on terror does and what Trump does is it signals and it shows white supremacists that, one of your primary groups that you got to care about are these Muslims. So you see the agendas of white supremacist outfits alt-right elements which become really popular circa the Trump era, situate an anti-Muslim agenda as being focal in their mission statements in a way that wasn't the case before Trump and pre-9/11. So Islamophobia in many ways reshapes white supremacy in the way it's configured in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and you even see this. I think if you've paid attention to the signs that people are holding, right? There's a whole myriad of groups that are being targeted. Muslims are just one of them at these rallies. Okay, so I think you touched on a very important point, which is that, you know, when elites normalize this type of rhetoric, you know, it can have profound downstream effects, at least theoretically. And in one of his first acts in office, not even a week after being sworn into office, Donald Trump signed an executive order banning nationals from 7 Muslim majority countries from entering the United States. He made good on his promise of a Muslim ban. And in the ensuing days, there were protests and all over the country at national landmarks and airports. And you really saw a mobilization of the American electorate in favor of Muslims. In fact, you saw politicians from both sides of the aisles going on and talking about religious liberty and, you know, essentially religious freedom and the foundations of, you know, an American identity being rooted in American religious freedom. And so you saw this very, I would say, interesting dynamic play out over the next year. You saw 3 iterations of a Muslim ban come down. And in the end, the 3rd executive order was upheld in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. So clearly in one of the first acts of office, there was anti-Muslim legislation or a policy that was issued by the president. The question is, in what ways, if any, did Islamophobia persist throughout the Trump administration?
Oh, in a myriad of ways.
And I ask you this question because I think about it a lot. Yeah, like how else has it manifested throughout the administration?
So it manifested itself, I think, in, like you said, the signature sort of, the crux of state-sponsored Islamophobia during the 4 years of Trump was very much the Muslim ban, right? So he demonstrated a swift commitment to enacting signing that executive order a week into his presidency, which signaled not only legally but sort of discursively that is, you know, anti-Muslim animus and Islamophobia would be focal to his administration, and he was essentially, you know, sort of keeping his promise to his base that this proposal that he was peddling when campaigning was not only rhetoric but a policy that he would follow up on, and he did not only once but 3 times, right? So when it was being attacked in the courts and being attacked by grassroots movements, like you mentioned, Trump did not. So he passed a second version, which, you know, included non-Muslim majority countries and sort of defanged the language of the order to sort of survive First Amendment scrutiny, which worked. You know, not only did it prove to be diabolical and clever presidential strategy, but the Supreme Court itself, the highest court in the land, upholds the Muslim ban. It says, and for those who know sort of like legal interpretation, I'm very opposed to what's called textualism. What the court says is everything Trump says beyond the language of the law doesn't matter, you know, which is insane, right? I think, I wouldn't say this in my constitutional law class, probably, you know, I might get in trouble, but it's insane for the Supreme Court to rule that everything Trump says and does beyond the language of the law is irrelevant. So we see federal policy in the Muslim ban being upheld. We see counter-radicalization policing being tweaked, right, in ways that kind of made it ineffective for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because Trump was viewed to be such a brazen Islamophobe. No Muslims wanted to work with him because it would mean career suicide to function as an informant for counter-radicalization under the Trump administration. But beyond the federal level, what's really critical to understand, and this kind of goes back to the question you just asked, is states, state governments, state legislators became far more vehement in passing what are called anti-Sharia laws in bills, right? These were proliferating under the time of Trump. Remember, Trump was in many ways like his rise was facilitated by the Tea Party. And the Tea Party and Trumpsters, not only in southern states, but states in the Midwest, the West Coast, the Northeast, were introducing these anti-Sharia bills, which sort of brought this structural Islamophobia from the federal level, but also to the state and city level. So during 4 years of Trump, the rhetoric that he had engaged in had facilitated and fueled policy on the federal, state, and city level that ushered in an unprecedented degree of state-sponsored Islamophobia by way of law and policy.
Yeah. These anti-Sharia bills, by the way, are written in a very strange way. It's just that we can't apply a foreign law. I mean, you would know much more than I would have, Khaled, but you can't apply a foreign law, which obviously we already can't do. So they're kind of symbolic and really ineffective. Thank you for that. I want to shift gears a little bit because we have seen resilience among two female members of Congress. And I want to talk about Representatives Rashida Tlaib as well as Ilhan Omar. Their election in 2018, in the Year of the Woman, was incredibly meaningful for the American Muslim community. But they made themselves, just by virtue of who they are, incredibly visible to the right and really at risk of attack and perpetual harm and hate. And so there's been, in the wake of so much prejudice, there's been this shining light of, look at us, we've got representation now in the House of Representatives. We had it before, but at least for women of color who are Muslim, now we have it in the form of two women. And so I'd love for you to talk about how the election of these two Muslim women to the House has shifted outcomes for the Muslim population in the United States in your view.
Yeah, I think in a myriad of ways. It was a landmark moment to have, two Muslim American congressmen being elected in sort of the thick of the Trump administration. And it's proven since their election to be far more than symbolic, right? Largely in part due to the kind of women Representatives Omar and Tlaib are. So I can speak on, Rashida's been a friend of mine for a long time. We grew up in the same communities in Michigan. And one way in which her presence in Congress has really shaped the discourse is around Palestine, right? She's somebody who has been very unapologetic about her Palestinian identity, but beyond just identity, she's somebody who's really committed to the dignity and humanity of Palestinian people. And you can see how, and she might not be the principal reason, but she's definitely a salient catalyst in how the popular discourse around Palestine has shifted in the last couple of years. And I think that her organizing behind closed doors, the fact that she's brokered relationships with really influential people, not only in Congress, but in government at large, has made a just and equitable resolution around Palestine far more possible than it was before her presence in DC. So that's one instance in which Rashida's presence in Congress has really made a material shift. With regard to Ilhan Omar out of Minnesota, she's probably the most sort of attacked Congress person in American history. The fact that she's endured what she's endured in these last couple of years, I think is a testament to her strength and her courage. And she's been attacked in ways that Rashida hasn't, because she wears the hijab and because she's a visible Muslim. And somebody in her position, you would think would cave in, would capitulate, would look to sort of guise their Muslim identity, but she hasn't, right? I think that she's remained the person she's always been, stood by very progressive policies, and she's been attacked by Muslim communities because she's taken some stances. So, in addition to being a target and a victim of Islamophobia from the highest sort of stratas of American government, she's also been attacked by the left and by the Muslim community. So it really shows that both of these women are not only resilient individuals, but resilient political actors that are, I know for a fact, have inspired and are creating inroads for the next generation of Muslim American leaders.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing I really loved about Ilhan Omar's campaign ad was the inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community. I think, you know, just seeing that, you know, coalitions, I think oftentimes, obviously, the Muslim community is often pitted against or portrayed as being anti-LGBTQ plus. And I think her being so deliberate about her inclusivity and her her desire to build coalitions and be part of the progressive arm has been very inspiring to, especially to a younger Muslim base. I want to shift gears to your new book. I've had a pleasure of reading it already. It's a book on global Islamophobia, and it makes an argument that Islamophobia is a phenomenon that occurs in other countries aside from the US. But the processes by which we see rampant discrimination here in the United States and as well as abroad, they are deeply tied to one another. And so I was wondering if you could sort of lay out your argument in your book for us.
Yeah. No, but I think before laying out my argument, one thing I'd like to mention that ties to the sort of mission and objective of this conference is, you know, I think for me, I write books that, you know, God willing, reach broad audiences. So the books that I'm interested in writing they're not academic texts. They're books that I hope, you know, can resonate and reach, you know, any individual, regardless of their, you know, educational status, whether they be individuals who are loosely interested in Islamophobia or individuals who are casually or really interested in the subject matter. I try to write books that sort of reach as broad an audience as possible. And this book definitely sort of continues in that spirit. And it looks to argue, because I think oftentimes we, especially here in the United States, you know, the American citizen, largely speaking, tends to be very Amerocentric and only views issues around race, bigotry, and Islamophobia from a domestic prism, which, you know, I found in my advocacy work and in the reason I'm so active on social media is that I try to sort of dismantle that notion and sort of bring in this, you know, missing culture of internationalism, that we draw connections between what's happening in the United States with what's happening in India, what's happening in France, what's happening in China, Myanmar, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth and so on. Because although there are distinctions, and there are distinctions, and it's fine that there are distinctions, but seeing the parallels, I think, is very illuminating. It enables a number of things. It enables building bridges with advocates in different countries, drawing analytical sort of connections that are intellectually informative. And that's what the book does. The book argues essentially that the American War on Terror as a sort of military experiment, but also kind of a heuristic experiment, gave the green light to other governments across the world to either do one of two things: initiate persecution and marginalization of their Muslim populations where it didn't exist beforehand, or to intensify it to measures that would not be the case if not for the American War on Terror. So the American War on Terror and American Islamophobia is not, you know, sort of animal that is confined to our boundaries here stateside. What took place and what was constructed post 9/11, you know, functions as the license and the fuel that has enabled the sort of intensification of the Islamophobia we see in places across the world. And what I try to do in the book is to draw on, you know, direct testimony of individuals on the ground to share their experiences. So I've conducted interviews with people in these various countries. And second, to really, you know, highlight the parallels in the laws of these distinct countries and the distinctions to help the reader understand how Islamophobia is similar in different parts of the world, but how it's distinct. And that's the objective of the book.
Yeah, it's a really great book. You all should read it. I guess I want to conclude with my questions with the final question, and then we can move to the Q&A because I know people are really excited to ask you questions. So for those of you who are in the audience and who have questions for Professor Beydoun, please do put them in the Q&A box now. My final question is about modern day Islamophobia, and this week. So in recent days, we've seen Islamophobia manifest to numerous degrees institutionally, from the headscarf ban in France that just keeps reifying itself. And then in contrast, you have courts in other contexts, especially in Western Europe, like in Sweden, Austria, or Belgium, who ruled that these bans are unconstitutional. But really there is this policing of Muslim women happening, much more so, I think, in Western Europe than in the United States, at least so far. Maybe these will be my famous last words. I guess it would be interesting to see, you know, what you think is at the root of these bans. And then do you foresee similar practices occurring in the United States?
Yeah, what's driving these bans in places like France, the Netherlands, and in Europe at large is this, you know, reclamation of European identity that is really aligned with whiteness, right? The fact that Islam for a long time and Muslim identity has been distinguished as being non-white and non-European. And I think that, you know, we all know that there's a far more long-standing, deeply rooted and familiar dynamic between Islam and Europe than there is with Islam in the United States. It's far more complex than Europe. But we're seeing this deep-seated Orientalism being fanned by the rise in populist movements, whether it be the Nationalist Front. They changed their name in France. I think they're called the Nationalist Force or something. They've changed, I don't know what they've changed their name to. But these populists have really, you know, captured the imagination of large swaths of the population to say that to be French is to be white, it is to be European, and most distinctly, it is to be non-Muslim. So when you combine that sentiment with legal architectures that enable the kind of persecution by way of headscarf bans, and again, there's no free exercise clause in France. There's no free exercise of religion clause in places like the Netherlands. If the state does not have to honor religious freedom by way of explicit constitutional guideline like it does in the United States, then we can very much see and imagine the possibility of hijab bans, niqab bans, further restrictions like this new anti-separatism bill in France has proposed that the National Assembly will be voting on really soon, because the law enables it. In the United States, at least theoretically, the law would foreclose that possibility, because any law that explicitly denies an individual's right to express their religion as they see fit would be, inshallah, stricken down. But you know, but I say inshallah.
Inshallah.
But because I didn't think the Supreme Court would uphold the Muslim.
I really didn't think either.
And then we have the Establishment Clause, right? So the state, in addition to the state not being able to favor one religion, the state is restricted in the United States from castigating or condemning one religion. So the religion clauses in the First Amendment, at least theoretically, function as a safeguard against similar provisions taking place in the United States. But again, you never know what can happen in the future.
You never know. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box and ask you a few questions from the audience. And then if there's a little bit of time, I have one final question about Uyghur. Okay, so our first question is, I had a question for Khaled Beydoun, since I'm a big fan and was able to do a paper on Islamophobia during 9/11. Question: do you see a difference in the reaction to Islamophobic practices like othering between first and second generation American Muslims?
So are the first and second generation Muslims they're the ones that are othering?
In the reaction to Islamophobic, yeah. So it's like, are there differences in othering between first generation American Muslims and second generation? Like, are people making distinctions, I think, between first and second generation Muslims when they discriminate?
I'll say this. I think that
at least I think that's what was.
I think the state definitely makes distinctions, and we see it specifically through the lens of counter-radicalization policing. So many of the algorithms that law enforcement used to surveil Muslims through CVE or counter-radicalization is that they were far more concerned with immigrants and first-generation Muslims, because the presumption is they were more religious, they had stronger ties to their home countries, and that first-generation Muslims were more sort of active with traveling back to their home countries. And the state kind of had this notion that second, third, fourth generation Muslims had fully assimilated and become more American and were less of a concern. So the state, there is a frequency where the state others distinctly others first and subsequent generation Muslim Americans.
Yeah, I wonder if the public does as well, if they draw those distinctions. It'd be interesting to have a look. Okay, so we also have a question that says, in the eyes of the federal government, Arab Americans are considered white. Recently, there have been debates in the Arab American communities over whether or not they should pursue a separate identity. How do you understand that debate and the benefits and dangers of each position?
Yeah, great question. So, I'm somebody who identifies as a critical race theorist. So I'll start off by saying that, race is a social construction, and whiteness being one of those classifications. Whiteness itself is a political construction as well. So I sort of presently reject the fact that Arab Americans are white, even though they're white by law, according to the U.S. Census and the Office of Management and Business, largely as a consequence of the state stigmatizing and otherizing Muslims as non-white. So if you're white, you want to attain the privileges of whiteness, and those privileges and benefits haven't come to the vast majority of Arab Americans. So I'll say this: I was part of the group that was pushing for this separate classification called the Middle Eastern and North African racial box that, starting in 2015, was generating a lot of momentum. I was in favor of it. I was suspicious of some aspects of it because no racial classification is going to be perfect. They're all flawed in some way. But I liked the box because it was an opportunity for Muslims to sort of, divest and disidentify as whites. And second, sort of like navigate their own, existential self-determination to identify in ways that they saw fit. And third, it was finally the state acknowledging that, Arab Americans, North Africans, groups from this broader North African and Middle Eastern region were culturally, ethnically, but most importantly, politically distinct as a consequence of the suspicion that was afflicted upon them post 9/11. But it failed. The state denied it for whatever reason. And the next opportunity for us to pursue an opportunity of bringing it back into the fold is 2030.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that. So Rashida Tlaib actually did a very good job of questioning why the MENA category was taken off the census, and I don't think ever received an answer, but has numerous times in open session asked about it. A second thing I will say is that a lot of scholarship has been done, actually run by the Office of Management and Budget, on just to pilot the MENA category, and they found a much greater level of attachment to the category from the populations that we care about. So this idea of self-determination being higher and whatnot was actually shown to be empirically true. And so it's really a shame that I think I would agree with you that this was not able to be on the 2020 census. I do want to sort of maybe poke at this question a bit more, though. So in the wake of 9/11, there were efforts among the Arab American community to disidentify as Muslim and really create like a distinction, right? There was a historical effort to even proclaim that the majority of Arab Americans were Christian. And so really there was this, this active effort to disentangle from the narrative post 9/11, and I'm wondering if you have perspective on that or thoughts on that.
Well, statistically, it's true, right?
Yeah.
The numbers are, but the majority of Arab Americans were Christian for a long time. The initial immigrant populations that came to the States from the quote unquote Arab world were overwhelmingly Christian, and people like Louis Sankar has written about this, and other scholars have written about the initial communities that Sarah Gaultieri has written about the Syrian population that was overwhelmingly Christian. That's a fact, and I agree with that position because it initiated serious work to say that Arab American identity is distinct from Muslim American identity because Orientalist groupthink conflates the two. But I didn't like that disentanglement from the point of anti-Muslim animus because you saw a lot of Arab Christian communities, in some respects, and many of them in Michigan that I know really well, sort of, adopt the same kind of Islamophobia the state was engaged in. to say that, hey, we're not the bad guys, we're not the Muslims you got to be worried about, we're Christians, and as a consequence of our Christian identity, we're Americans, and we're individuals you should not be concerned and suspicious about. So that was something I didn't like, and that you see really sort of emerge post 9/11 with, I'm not going to say all Christian Arab communities, but definitely segments of the Arab Christian community.
Yeah, you saw it manifest with the Syrian refugee crisis as well, especially when the third executive order came down and there were efforts to deport refugees who had come to the United States, but who were of Christian origin, who were still facing deportation processes. And there was almost a shock that how could this apply to us? Saw that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's exactly right. And I think there was explicit mention in the first Muslim ban of sort of a Christian exception, that if you were a Christian, then the ban
There was. Yes, there was. Oh man, it flew in the face.
Muslims should have, maybe there should have been like a quick conversion or taqiyya, right?
I can't do anything but face palm. Okay, let's move on to another question. Thank you so much for that. So Said says in his work of Orientalism that representation is skewed and there is no way to rectify it because the Orient does not have the opportunity to do so. Do you think that we've made any progress in narrating our own Muslim American stories accurately post 9/11?
No, that's a hard question, because I think that, one thing that I'm thinking about now, and maybe this is something you and I and Professor Khalid could talk about at a later point, is we're kind of at this weird moment of racial capitalism, where the state, corporations, institutions at large are really committed to a surface form of diversity. But for me, I'm really concerned about how this diversity just really leads to sort of two things, like, tokenization on one hand, which is not a solution. And then second, mooting legitimate concerns that Muslim Americans have by viewing representation as a cure-all. So it's great to see that we have, Muslim American academics at institutions like Michigan State, Wayne State, Stanford, Harvard, all these great schools in numbers and in ways that hasn't existed before. It's great seeing congresswomen like Ilhan and Rashida at the highest posts of American government. It's great to see journalists like Ayman Muhyiddin and Mahdi Hassan, really dominating large audiences in ways that are unprecedented. But that isn't enough for me, right? I think that for me, the real measure of progress is shift in policy, significant shift in discourse. And representation might be kind of a manifestation of those two things, but we can't be smitten, we can't be seduced just by virtue of having larger numbers of Muslims in places of power, that itself is a metric of progress, because I don't think it is. And I think that we can look at the experiences of other groups, the African American community, for instance, right? Having a Black president, did not coincide with rising employment rates for African Americans. Did not coincide with decreasing the incarceration rates of Black men and women. Did not coincide with the dismantling of the school to prison pipeline. So the war on terror is continuing. The war in Yemen is continuing. The state of Palestine is becoming more dire by the day. Surveillance of Muslim communities is continuing. Representation of Muslims in places of power has not ended those things. And until those things end or at least diminish, then I'm not going to be as hopeful.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. There's a question that kind of goes back to the Arab American whiteness dialogue. So I just want to ask it because I think the person really does want clarifications from an anonymous attendee. The person writes, it does seem that as an Arab American, legally white, what protections does the community have if we are discriminated as Arabs?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more of a rhetorical point.
Yeah.
That there is like, there might be legal protections, but
well, not really, right? So if you look at the way hate crimes law functions, so a group can be legally classified as white by the census or by OMB, but still be subject and privy to racial or ethnic discrimination. We see that with Jewish Americans, for instance, who by and large identify as white. We also see that with Arab Americans, Iranian Americans, and so forth and so on, that their nationality or ethnic identification enables them to seek hate crimes relief in ways that other white groups have for a long time. I think it complicates it, right? Because having your own standalone box makes it easier, but also other areas of the law, for instance, right? Title VII discrimination, for instance. There's a case called El Khazraji, where an Iraqi American professor sued the university. The university says we can't discriminate against this guy because this guy is white by law. But the court acknowledges in that case that even though legally identified as white by the Census Bureau, this individual, by virtue of being Iraqi, qualifies for the kind of racial or ethnic discrimination that garners Title VII protection. So there are other legal mechanisms that sort of cut and pierce this legal classification that the census has. What the census does though is that it sort of grays and complicates the picture for Arab Americans. But it's not the only piece of American law that has a racializing effect on Arab Americans.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, that was very illuminating. I would like to switch to sort of switch our discussion. We don't have too much more time, but I'd like to talk about Uyghurs and the plight of Uyghur Muslims in China. You've done, I think, a really tremendous job of advocating and illuminating information to the mass public, and so thank you for what you've done in those spaces. But I don't think we know enough about what is happening as a collective to Muslim brothers and sisters in China right now in the Xinjiang province. So I don't know if you would like to give some context, and then maybe we can have a short discussion about what kind of avenues we can take forward, especially those of us in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 2018, the United Nations broke news that the Chinese government had these prison camps, these concentration camps in Xinjiang province, which is a territory northwest that the indigenous Uyghur call East Turkestan and claim to be their native land. It was a land that was annexed by the Chinese government after 1949 that has significant economic, strategic, and political value to the Chinese government, especially as the Chinese government ascends in being a geopolitical power and has, real economic and political designs which really, align with them having a stranglehold over Xinjiang. But we see, and what we've heard is of, really horrific persecution taking place in Xinjiang, which amounts to the level of ethnic cleansing or genocide. Many states, including the United States, European countries, have called it a full-fledged cultural genocide. There have been, reportedly, depending on who you read, 2 to 5 Uyghur and other ethnic Muslims being placed in these prison camps. Children have been placed in brainwashing orphanages. Ramadan, which we're celebrating in 4 or 5 days, has been criminalized in Xinjiang. Prayer has been criminalized. Muslim women have been sterilized to prevent them from having children. You have forced marriages. And a lot of this is racial, by the way, right? Because the Uyghur are a distinct ethnic group. China is controlled by an ethnic group called the Han. They comprise 90% of the Chinese population. So the Han-controlled government is looking to exterminate, maybe not the Uyghur people, they're looking to sort of reprogram them culturally, but to exterminate Uyghur culture and identity, which is closely tethered to Muslim identity. So it's an ongoing ethnic cleansing program that is, in my estimation, and I've been talking about this for a couple of years, has garnered limited. What's crazy to me is that I'm kind of thinking about a lot. Everybody is quick to call out France for their Islamophobia, but those voices aren't doing the same for China. Yeah, and I think a lot of that testifies to the economic influence China has in, many places, including Muslim communities, including Muslim governments. So there's a lot of, I don't want to, I know cancel culture is a real thing, and I'm victimized by it sometimes. but I'm not trying to call anybody out, but there's a lot of like, it's kind of curious about a lot of like Muslim leaders who are gung-ho about what's going on in France or the States, really silent about China. To me, what that demonstrates is China has political and economic influence in many people's pockets, and that's a big reason why we're not seeing the kind of attention being credited to what's going on in China with the Uyghur. And it's frustrating to me. Like, this is me like taking off my academic hat.
I don't know. I mean,
I have a solution about it.
It's remarkable because I think so there's two parts about all this that I think are really discouraging. One is that it's not something that we talk about in Jummah. It's not something that we talk about in our with other Muslims. This is not a sticking point in conversation. In fact, I think I would hazard a guess that many Muslims don't even know this is happening, nor do they care in the same way that they do about the Israel-Palestinian issue. Yeah. And I think this is what's very frustrating, because you have, as you've put, a cultural genocide. I think as many reports have found to also be true. But you have an erasure of millions of Muslims from Chinese society. And I really do not understand, I think, how we see this lack of participation from other Muslims, and then from Muslim majority countries. I think you're absolutely right that there are political and economic forces at play that definitely bind their hands, but they're also at play with other incidents and forms of Islamophobia that are happening in other contexts as well.
I think if I can add this really quickly, Nazita.
Yeah.
I think it also reveals an uncomfortable truth about the Muslim American population specifically, is that there's definitely an Arab centrism going on, in where we sort of prioritize the concerns of Arab oriented issues and concerns, and sort of relegate what's going on beyond the Arab Muslim world. So in the same vein, there's little attention given to Kashmir. There's little attention given to what's happening with Modi in India. Obviously, there's little attention given to what's happening even in Myanmar, right, where the Rohingya have endured ethnic cleansing as well. So much of this has to be, ethnic in nature, that we tend to prioritize the crises faced by Arab Muslims and relegate the concerns of other Muslim communities. And to kind of circle back to the beginning of this conversation, that's what really drives my social media, is that I try to give face and voice to the relegated Muslim concerns globally as best I can.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very much appreciated. I mean, thank you so much, Khaled, for engaging in this conversation in this hour. I'd like to just make a pitch for anyone interested in learning more about the plight of Uyghurs. Please do join us at Michigan State. Anna Brachich, Mark Brandt, and myself host a weekly seminar called MPOS, the Minority Politics Online Seminar Series. And on May 11th, we are going to have a special panel on China's Uyghur genocide with the president of the Uyghur American Association, the president of the Campaign for Uyghurs, the general secretary of the Uyghur Revival Association, Sean Roberts, who is a professor at George Washington University and the author of The War on Uyghurs, the program and advocacy manager at the World Uyghur Congress, as well as a faculty member from the University of College London, who is an expert in international human rights law. If you have any questions about that, please do let me know. We're going to have a 1.5-hour panel highlighting these issues. So I want to take a moment. I want to thank you so much, Khaled, for engaging in this discussion. I really think this has been an amazing opportunity, especially for myself, but I'm sure for others to learn from you and your vast array of knowledge. And thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks so much for having me. Hopefully we'll see you guys in East Lansing soon.
Inshallah soon.
Yes, and I want to take this opportunity to thank both of our panelists, Professor Beydoun, Professor Lajevardi, for a very rich, thoughtful, and interesting conversation. And we will now take an hour break. And when we resume, we will have our second and final panel for the day. So that will be at 12:45, so exactly an hour from now. Thank you, and we will resume in an hour.